back in the 1970s, the early 70s, all the way through the 70s to about 78, I worked in the mining industry. I worked underground, I worked open pit, and you know the best thing about mining, I mean really, it's hard work, but it's good money. But the best thing is you get to work with explosives, and I mean that's your whole day. You know, when you got this big rock you got to blow up, it doesn't matter how much work you have to do, you're happy to do it because you're going to blow something up. And you know, I got good with explosives, and I got even better when I went into the open pit. I could do it outside and actually see what was happening. And then, just by a twist of fate, one day, I got this special bonus I could take home from work. It was a big, well, they called it horse cock, but what it was a big piece of explosives. This was the old water gels. This was after the Foresight. This was not a dangerous powder. It was a 4-inch thick, 16-inch long piece of dynamite. So I took this and I threw it in my Jeep. And I drove around trying to think of something to do with that. You know, all I needed was a blasting cap and some fuse, and that was easy to accumulate. So for 6 months, I drove around with this powder bouncing around in the back of my Jeep. And I was so tired of blowing up rocks. I wanted to do something spectacular, something I hadn't seen before. But every idea I had always ended with the same sentence. And then I'd go to jail for 20 years. So, you know, it became so frustrating. I knew it was only a matter of time before, you know, some restaurant would burn my steak, or maybe the bank would charge me a late fee, and my mind would snap because the temptation was there. So on a visit down here to the coast, I ran into one of my old biker buddies, Mr. 84 Dan, and I handed it off to him. Now, he was by far the most sensible of all my bike riding friends. I knew he'd put it to good use. He'd do something that would make us all proud. About 6 months later, I rode back to town on a brand new Harley, and again, I ran into Dan. We talked about this and that, then I mentioned that powder, and I was disappointed to find that Dan had not used it. He'd stuck it in the vegetable crisper of his fridge where no one would be looking, and it had been there all this time. Now Dan became worried. He says, look, that's a long time to leave dynamite around. Won't it go bad? Won't it be dangerous? I says, no. This is the water gels. The only thing it does is lose power after time. It's not the old Foresight that sweats with nitroglycerin coming out of its good. But Dan was still nervous. He wanted to get rid of it. So after a day of eating and drinking at a couple of Richmond party houses, we decided to head over to his place just after supper. We grabbed the powder and a couple of hammers and a fistful of nails, and we headed for River Road. Now the place we wanted to go was a little spot known as the Tree Bar. We used to fish there occasionally, and since it wasn't fishing season, you know, we thought we'd have it to ourselves. And as we cruised down River Road and approached the Tree Bar, we saw we were wrong. No, there was already a group of people there. We saw, well, it was a bunch of hippie kids. They even had the VW van. There was 2 guys, 2 girls sitting around a campfire, drinking wine, playing guitars, and enjoying the evening. Well, Dan and I decided to head a few miles up the road, see if we could find a better spot. But just past the Tree Bar, we found just what we were looking for. Beside the road, there was a couple of short pieces of logs and some old planks. We parked the hogs, got off, went down to the shoreline, and before you knew it, we had jimmied up a crude raft. We tied the powder to the raft. I told Dan to trim the fuse. And I also explained to him, this stuff burns at 40 seconds a foot. So he cut off the appropriate amount of fuse. And not being a smoke hound, I imposed upon Dan to light the fuse. So once that was going, I used a big pole to push it out in the river. Then we sat back and we hunkered down behind the bikes and waited for it to go off. But nothing happened. It kept going and going and going. And I turned to Dan and I says, didn't you cut any of that fuse off? He says, yeah, about this much. He thought I said 4 seconds a foot, and he'd only cut off 2 inches of the 8 feet we already had. So now the current, combined with the outgoing tide, had gotten a hold of our little raft and was moving it westward at a pretty good clip. We ran along the shore, keeping it in sight because we didn't want to miss this great visual. As it got closer to the Tree Bar, Dan turned to me and said, hey, looks like we're going to have some witnesses. And Dan was right. Because, you know, when that thing finally did go off, it was directly in front of the hippie encampment and only about 40 feet from shore. Boom! The explosion was glorious. The geyser was 30 feet across the bottom and 100 feet in the air. The concussion blew the hippie campfire not only out, but out onto the road. Their guitar was in pieces. They scrambled towards the VW van and sputtered off down River Road as fast as a VW can sputter. Now, what we should have done is gone the other way. That made sense. But, you know, curiosity, right? So we hopped on our bikes and we kept that hippy-dippy van in sight as it went down River Road and went about 2 miles, turned the corner on 6th Road and came to a stop. We were wondering, would they go to the police? Would they get help somewhere? But they were shaken. They pulled over. We pulled in behind them. Dan stayed on his bike. I got off mine and walked up to the window. I looked inside. The 2 boys were in the front. I looked in the window and I got the guy's attention and I said, "Hey! What the hell did you kids do back there?" The driver of the van says, "It wasn't us, man. We didn't do nothing." I says, "Well, hey, I'll tell you what. Me and my friend were fishing just up the river from you and we heard this big boom." And the guy goes, "Yeah, man, it wasn't us." So I gave him one of these doubting looks, you know. At that point, the guy on the passenger side had had enough. He climbed across the driver, stuck his big afro head out the window and looked me in the eye and he says, "I know what happened, man. I saw what went down." I thought, shit, they're on to us. But I wanted to play it cool. So I went, what went down, man? And that hippy-dippy kid, he looked me right in the eye and he told me with true conviction, he says, "I know what happened, man. Someone on the other side of the river shot a rocket at us." I said, And I walked back to 84 Dan and I says, "Dan, we gotta get out of here. Someone on the other side of the river is shooting rockets at people." Then we rode off into the warm summer night, never to be seen again. Thank you very much.